My wife knew she was going to die before the doctors told me she was going to die. That is where this story begins. Not at the hospital, not in the parking lot, not at the nurse's station with two women whispering outside a room that was already empty. It begins 18 months earlier in our kitchen on a Tuesday morning when Pauline set down her coffee cup, looked at me across the table, and said, "Raymond, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear the whole thing before you say a word." I said, "Okay." She told me. Not about the diagnosis, which came 3 weeks later, and which confirmed everything she had already understood from the inside. She told me about something else, something she had seen, something she had been sitting with for 4 months before she sat down across from me at that kitchen table and decided it was time. She told me about our son's wife, and then she told me what she had already done about it. I sat across from Pauline in our kitchen, and I listened to every word, and when she finished I understood that my wife, who was the most quietly intelligent person I had ever known, had spent 4 months building something in secret. Not for herself, for me, for the version of me that was going to exist after she was gone. She had built it because she loved me, and she had built it because she knew me well enough to understand that grief makes men slow, and slow men get taken advantage of, and she was not going to let that happen to me if she had any say in the matter. She had a great deal of say in the matter. This is her story as much as mine. I want you to understand that before we go any further. Welcome to Dad's Retribution. Get comfortable. Pour something warm. Because what my wife left in a sealed envelope with 2 nurses 3 days before she passed is one of the most extraordinary things I have ever held in my hands. And I have held a lot of things in 66 years. None of them prepared me for this. Subscribe right now if you are new here, and hit that bell. Because Pauline spent 18 months preparing something that she never got to see land. I am going to make sure it lands the right way. Let me tell you about Pauline. Pauline Marie Osei, born Pauline Maria Deyemi in 1958, in a city I will not name, because she would have told me specifics were beside the point, and the point was all that mattered. She was 64 years old when she left this world. She was, by any accounting that matters, extraordinary. She had been a high school mathematics teacher for 26 years. Not a person who taught mathematics the way some people teach it, as a series of procedures to be memorized and performed. She taught it as a language. She used to say that every student who came into her classroom was already a mathematician, they just didn't know the vocabulary yet, and her job was the vocabulary. Parents requested her specifically. Students came back years later to tell her what she had made possible. She retired in 2018 and immediately started tutoring 3 students from the local community for free, because she said full retirement was for people who weren't curious anymore, and she was still curious about everything. She had been my wife for 38 years. I want you to understand what 38 years means. It means she knew things about me that I did not know about myself. It means she had a picture of me that was more complete than my own. It means that when she looked at a situation involving me, she could see 3 moves ahead in the way that a mathematician sees 3 moves ahead. Not because she was cynical, but because she understood the variables. The variables she had been watching for 4 months, before she sat down at the kitchen table to tell me, was our daughter-in-law Miriam. Our son's name is David. He is 41 years old. He is a civil engineer. He is a good man in the specific way that good men are sometimes also slightly credulous men, which is to say that he trusts people because he himself is trustworthy, and he has not yet fully internalized the gap between those 2 things. He married Miriam in 2018. She was 39 at the time. She was a financial consultant who worked with small business owners on cash flow management and growth strategy. She was sharp. She was put together. She had the particular quality of someone who understood money in the way that a certain category of person understands money, not as a tool for building things, but as a resource to be located and redirected. I noticed that quality at the wedding. I noticed it at the first Christmas. I filed it in the place where I file things that have not yet become actionable, but that I do not want to lose track of. Pauline noticed it earlier than I did. She noticed it in the way that teachers notice things, which is by watching what a person does when they think the lesson has moved on and nobody is looking at them anymore. Teachers know that the most honest behavior in a room happens in the margins. In the moments between the main event, Pauline had 26 years of watching margins, and she had been applying that skill to Miriam since the night of the wedding rehearsal dinner, when Miriam had asked 4 questions about my pension structure during what should have been dessert. 4 questions about my pension at a rehearsal dinner. Pauline had noted them. She had said nothing to me that night. She had filed them in the place she filed things, and she had watched for more. Over the following 18 months before she sat down with her coffee and told me, she had collected the following. Miriam had asked David, in conversations that David had relayed to Pauline without understanding their significance, 7 questions about my financial assets, the house, the pension, an investment account I had been building since 1989, a small commercial property I owned in a neighboring town that generated modest rental income. Each question framed as natural curiosity or responsible planning. Each question, in Pauline's reading of them, something else. Pauline had also, and this is the part that makes me understand afresh every time I think about it what kind of woman she was, begun speaking to a friend. Her friend was a woman named Constance Webb, who had been Pauline's closest friend since 1994, and who was, before she retired, an estate planning attorney with 30 years of practice. Pauline had been talking to Constance about our estate documents since the previous year, not because of the diagnosis, which had not yet happened, because of what she was observing. When the diagnosis came, the conversations with Constance became something more structured. Pauline, who had been told she had perhaps 18 months, and who received this information with the specific composure of a woman who had already prepared for it emotionally before the doctor named it, sat across from me at the kitchen table and told me all of it in sequence. The questions, the pattern, the 4 months of watching, the conversations with Constance. And then she told me what Constance had helped her build. She said, "Raymond, I need you to listen to what I have done, and I need you not to argue with any of it, because I have thought about it more carefully than you will have time to, between now and when it needs to be real." I said, "Tell me." She told me, "If you are still with me right now, I need you to do something before I continue. Hit that like button. Share this with one person in your life who needs to hear a story about a woman who loved her husband so much that she spent the last 18 months of her life making sure he would be protected after she was gone. And subscribe, because I have been building to this moment in this story for a long time, and what comes next is the part that changes everything. What Pauline and Constance had built together was this. First, a comprehensive revision of our estate documents. Not a dramatic revision, a precise one. Constance had reviewed everything we had: the will, the property deeds, the investment account beneficiary designations, the pension survivor benefits. All of it reviewed and, where necessary, restructured with the specific goal of making every asset I owned clear in its ownership, its succession, and its protection. Second, a revocable living trust. Our assets, specifically the house and the commercial property, transferred into the trust. Constance named as successor trustee, me as primary trustee for my lifetime. Our daughter Angela, who is 38 years old and lives in Atlanta, and calls me every Thursday evening without fail, and has never once asked me a question about my pension, named as residential beneficiary. Third, and this is the piece that took my breath away when Pauline explained it to me, a document Pauline had written, in her own hand, over a period of 4 months, a complete and precise account of everything she had observed about Miriam. Every question, every conversation David had relayed, every margin behavior she had catalogued across 2 years of watching. She had written it with the specificity of a mathematician, and the clarity of a teacher, and the love of a woman who understood that the document she was writing was the most important lesson plan she had ever prepared. The document was not a legal instrument. It was something more personal and in some ways more powerful than a legal instrument. It was a record of what Pauline had seen, written in her voice, dated and signed, with Constance's notarization on the final page. She called it in the way she named things, simply, what I know. She said, Raymond, this document is not going to change anything by itself. It is not a lawsuit, and it is not a threat. It is a record. The kind of record that protects a man who is going to be grieving, and therefore slow, when people around him start making moves. She said, I need you to keep it safe. I need you to read it when the time comes, and I need you to trust that I saw what I saw. I said, Pauline, I always trust what you see. She said, I know. That is why I am telling you before I can't anymore. We sat at that kitchen table for a long time after that, not talking. The way we had always been able to sit in quiet together, the way that only works between people who have spent decades learning each other's silences. Then she said, Raymond, there is one more thing. I said, tell me. She said, I am going to leave something at the hospital, when the time comes. Not now, closer to the end. I am going to leave it with people I trust there, and I am going to tell them that only you can open it. I need you not to ask me what it is. I looked at my wife. She looked back at me with the eyes of a woman who has already done her grieving privately, and is now in the business of making sure the people she loves are taken care of. I said, Okay, Pauline. She said, Thank you. We did not speak about it again for 18 months. Not because we avoided it, because everything that needed to be said about it had been said. She had told me what I needed to know. I had told her I trusted her. There was nothing to add. The 18 months were the best and the worst of my life in proportions I cannot separate. The best because Pauline was still there, because we had mornings in the kitchen, and evenings on the porch, and Sunday dinners, and the particular ordinary texture of a shared life that you do not understand the weight of until you are watching it count down. We did things we had talked about doing. We drove to the coast twice. We saw Angela in Atlanta for a long weekend in the spring that I will carry with me for the rest of my life. Pauline finished a quilt she had been working on for 3 years, and gave it to a former student who was having her first baby. The worst, because I knew. Every morning I woke up knowing. Every evening I sat on the porch knowing. You learn to hold the knowing in a specific way, not in front of everything, but underneath everything, present always but not always visible. It becomes the bass note of each day. You learn to hear the music on top of it, without letting the bass note drown it out. Pauline got better at living in that structure than I did. She was always better at structures than I was. David visited 6 times in those 18 months. He brought Miriam 4 of those 6 times. Pauline was warm with her, warmer than I might have managed. She had the particular grace of a woman who understood that how she treated the people around her in her final months was itself a kind of document, a record of who she was, and she was not going to compromise that record for the satisfaction of showing Miriam what she knew. I watched Miriam watching the house, the way her eyes moved across rooms, the questions she asked David in voices she thought I could not hear. I heard them. I filed them alongside what Pauline had already filed, and I said nothing, because Pauline had asked me to say nothing, and I trusted Pauline more than I trusted my own anger. In the final 3 weeks, Pauline was at St. Augustine's Hospital. It was a good facility. The people there were good people. She had been there enough times in the preceding months that several of the nurses knew her, and she knew them in the way that Pauline knew everyone, by their actual names and by what mattered to them. I was there every day, morning and afternoon. I would leave in the evening because she told me to go home and sleep in a real bed, and I would go home and not sleep in a real bed and come back in the morning. On the day she passed, I had been there since 7 in the morning. Angela had flown in 2 days earlier and was there. David was there. The room was quiet in the specific way of rooms where something is about to happen that words are not sufficient for. She passed at 4:17 in the afternoon on a Thursday in November. I am not going to tell you about those minutes, because they are mine. They are mine and Angela's and David's, and they belong to us and to the woman who taught mathematics for 26 years and made a quilt for a former student and sat across kitchen tables and saw things in margins and spent the last 18 months of her life making sure I would be taken care of. They are not for this story. What is for this story? is what happened when I went back inside. I sat in the parking lot of St. Augustine's Hospital for an hour. I do not know exactly what I was doing out there. I was not crying, though I had cried. I was not thinking in any organized way. I was simply sitting in my truck the way a man sits when the world has changed its fundamental shape, and he needs a few minutes before he operates inside the new shape. An hour, maybe a few minutes more. Then I went back inside to collect Pauline's things. The hallway outside her room had the particular quiet of a space that has recently been cleared. The equipment gone, the door partially open, the particular after-quality of a room that was one thing and is now another. 2 nurses were standing near the nurses' station down the hall. They were speaking in low voices. Not unusual. Nurses are always speaking in low voices. But something in the posture of it, the specific lean of 2 people saying something that mattered, made me look at them. One of them saw me. She went pale. Not the polite pale of someone caught in an awkward moment. The specific pale of someone who has been waiting for something and has just realized it has arrived and is not entirely sure they are ready. The other nurse turned. She looked at me. She straightened in the way people straighten when they are about to do something they have thought about doing. She walked toward me. She said, "Mr. Osei, I am so sorry for your loss. My name is Nurse Danielle. I was one of your wife's primary nurses for the last 2 weeks." I said, "I remember you." She said, "Sir, 3 days ago, your wife asked us to hold something for her. She said that after she was gone, if you came back to collect her things, we were to give it to you. She was very specific. She said only you could open it." She held out a padded envelope, sealed. My name written on the front in Pauline's handwriting. The handwriting that had been in my life for 38 years. The handwriting that had written grocery lists and birthday cards and report card comments, and the document she called What I Know. I took the envelope. My hands were not entirely steady. I said, "Did she tell you what was inside?" Nurse Danielle said, "She did not. She said you would understand when you opened it. She said it was something she had been working on for a long time, and that she wanted to make sure it got to the right person." "The right person," I said. "Thank you." I carried the envelope to the family waiting room at the end of the hall. I sat in a chair by the window where the last of the November light was coming in gray and thin. I opened it. Inside was a letter and a key. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, Pauline's hand. I recognized the slight forward lean of her letters, the way she formed her capital R, the particular loop on her lowercase g that had been in every note she had ever given me since 1986. She began it the way she began things, without preamble, because preamble was for people who were not sure of what they were saying. She wrote, "Raymond, if you are reading this, then I am already gone, and you have done what I asked, which is that you went back inside. Good. Now listen to me for 1 more minute, because I need to tell you what the key is for, and what I need you to do with it. I will not read you the whole letter. Some of it is mine, but I will tell you what mattered for this story." She told me about a safety deposit box. Box number 447 at First Consolidated Bank on Meridian Avenue. She had rented it 18 months ago, 3 weeks after the diagnosis. She had gone on a Tuesday morning while I was at a doctor's appointment of my own. She had put things in it. The key in the envelope was the key to box 447. She told me what was in the box. Not in general terms, specifically. The way she did everything. The updated estate documents that Constance had prepared. A complete copy of the trust. Copies of every beneficiary designation. A copy of What I Know. The document she had written over 4 months. Dated and signed and notarized. A second letter, addressed to David, which she asked me to give to him when the time was right, and she trusted me to know when the right time was. And one more thing. She had put in the box, in a sealed folder, documentation that Constance had helped her compile over the preceding 6 months. Financial records, property records, a specific document that cross-referenced the questions Miriam had asked David with publicly available records about assets she had described in those questions. Pauline had hired, through Constance's referral, a woman named Felicia Grant, who was a forensic accountant. She had hired her quietly. She had paid her from a personal account that I had not known existed, one she had maintained separately since early in our marriage, as what she called a teacher's emergency fund, which I had known about in general terms, but had not known the full contents of. What Felicia had found was in the box. I am going to tell you what it was in a moment, but first I want you to understand something about sitting in a hospital waiting room in November with 4 pages of your wife's handwriting and a key to a box that she rented 18 months ago because she was already thinking about this day. I sat there for a long time. Not because I was reading slowly, because I was understanding something that took time to fully arrive at. The understanding that the woman I had loved for 38 years had spent the last 18 months of her life, while managing a terminal illness with her characteristic composure, also managing this, also watching, also building, also preparing. She had done it so that I would not have to do it alone, so that the version of me that was going to exist in the months after her death, the slow and grieving and reduced version of me, would still be protected by the version of her that had been sharp and present and forward-thinking. She had built me a safety net out of her last 18 months. I sat in that chair by the window, and I read the last paragraph of her letter. She wrote, "Raymond, you are going to be fine. Not right away, but you are going to be fine. You know why? Because I spent 38 years making sure you had what you needed. And I am not going to stop now just because I am not there to hand it to you directly. The box has everything. Constance has copies of everything. Angela knows about the box. I told her 2 weeks ago because she is the one who is most like me, and she will know what to do with what she knows." She wrote, "I love you more than any sequence of words I know has ever been sufficient to express. You were the best decision I ever made. Be careful. Be slow. Read what I know before you read anything else. And Raymond, please water the roses. The pink ones on the east side need more water than you think they do. You always forget." I sat in that chair until the light was gone from the window. Then I went to the bank. Box 447 was smaller than I expected for what was in it. That is the thing about Pauline. She was always economical. She did not use more space than something required. She filled that box with exactly what needed to be in it, and nothing more, and when I opened it, and laid the contents on the table in the private viewing room the bank provided, it was 6 inches of paper that represented 18 months of quiet, precise, determined love. I read what I know first, the way she had asked. It took me 40 minutes. She had been watching Miriam with the eyes of a mathematician for 26 months, and what she had documented was not drama, and it was not accusation. It was data, pattern recognition, the specific record of a woman who understood that the most dangerous thing in a room is often the thing that is working very hard to look like the least dangerous thing in the room. What Felicia, the forensic accountant, had found, documented in the sealed folder, was this. Miriam had, at some point in the preceding year, opened a financial account with David as a joint holder. David had mentioned it to Pauline in passing, framing it as something Miriam had suggested for household financial management. A joint savings vehicle, a responsible step, the kind of thing that reasonable partners do. What the account had been doing, which was not what David believed it had been doing, was receiving transfers, not large transfers, careful ones, below the amounts that trigger automatic review. The kind of transfers that a person who understands financial monitoring would know to keep at a specific size. The transfers were coming from a source that Felicia had traced, with the kind of patience that forensic accountants have, because they understand that money leaves marks even when the person moving it has tried very hard to make it not, to a business entity. A consulting LLC registered 18 months prior, an LLC with one owner. The owner was Miriam. The money that was being transferred into the joint account she had opened with David was coming from the consulting LLC she controlled, which meant the money that David believed was shared savings was money that had originated with Miriam and could at any time be characterized in a way that supported a claim on assets that David believed were his separately. It was not theft. It was positioning, the patient, careful positioning of a woman who understood that the question of what belongs to whom in a marriage depends enormously on the paper trail that exists when the question is asked. I sat at the table in the bank's private room with Pauline's documentation in front of me, and I thought about the 4 questions at the rehearsal dinner, and I thought about David saying, "Mom, I'm happy. She makes me happy." And I thought about what Pauline had written at the top of the last page of What I Know. She had written, "Raymond, this is not about punishing anyone. This is about making sure the truth is documented before someone has a reason to argue with it. The truth is always easier to protect when you establish it before the conflict, not after. That is the first thing I tell my students. It is the first thing I am telling you." I closed the folder. I picked up my phone. I called Angela. She answered on the first ring. She said, "Dad." I said, "I went to the box." She said, "I know. Mom told me you would go tonight." I said, "She told you about the box." She said, "She told me 2 weeks ago. She said you would need someone to talk to after you read it, and she wanted that person to already know." I said, "Angela." She said, "I know, Dad. I know." We talked for an hour. She told me what Pauline had said to her in those last 2 weeks. Not about the documents or Miriam or any of it. About me. About the life we had built. About what Angela should watch for, and when to speak, and when to let things develop, and when to move. Pauline had briefed our daughter on her strategy for protecting me, the way a commander briefs a trusted officer, before going into a situation they cannot be present for. I did not feel managed. I felt loved. There is a difference, and it is the entire difference. I called Constance the next morning. She was expecting my call. She had been expecting it since Pauline passed, had been told to expect it, had already pulled the relevant files. We met at her office on a Thursday afternoon, 5 days after the hospital. She was a small, precise woman of 67 with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the particular quality of someone who has spent 30 years in estate law and has long since stopped being surprised by human behavior, but has also long since stopped being cynical about it. She spread the documents on her desk. She walked me through everything Pauline had built with methodical clarity. The trust was solid. The documents were airtight. What I know was preserved in the way that a notarized document is preserved, formally, permanently, available as a record if it was ever needed. She said, "Raymond, I want to explain something to you about what Pauline asked me to do." I said, "Tell me." She said, "She did not ask me to help her stop what Miriam was doing. She was very clear about that. She said it was not her place to intervene in her son's marriage. What she asked me to do was make sure the truth was documented before anyone had a reason to contest it. A record so complete that if the day ever came when David needed to understand what had been happening, the information would be there. Not to be weaponized, to be available." She slid a folder across the desk. She said, "There is one more thing. She asked me to deliver an instruction she left out of the letter because she wanted it said in person." I said, "Tell me." She said to wait. "Whatever you are thinking about doing with the information in the box, wait 90 days. She said grief makes men fast in the wrong direction. She said if you still believe the same things after 90 days, then act, but let the grief settle first. She said you owed her that." I sat across from Constance, and I thought about the kitchen table and the roses, and 38 years. I said 90 days. Constance said she was very specific. I said she always was. The 90 days are the hardest part of this story to describe, because from the outside they look like nothing. A man going through grief, attending the funeral, thanking people, going back to the house that still had her coffee cup in the cabinet and her coat on the hook. Angela came for 2 weeks after the funeral. She cooked and sat with me in the evenings the way Pauline had taught her to sit with people, without filling the silence unnecessarily. David came often. His grief was genuine, and I held it alongside my own, without letting what I knew interfere with what he needed from me. That was one of the hardest things I have ever done. To be a father to a grieving son, while holding the specific knowledge I was holding, and waiting the 90 days his mother had asked me to wait. Miriam came twice. She was appropriate. She sat in Pauline's kitchen and accepted coffee and said all the right things. I watched her the way Pauline had taught me to watch, in the margins. I said nothing. I waited. On day 91, I called David. I asked him to come alone. He came on a Saturday morning. I made breakfast. The full breakfast. The one his mother used to make on mornings that required fortification. He ate. We talked about ordinary things. Then I cleared the table, and I set the folder on it. I said, "David, I need to show you something your mother left for you." He said, "What is this?" I said, "It is something she spent 18 months building. For you. And I am giving it to you now. Because 90 days ago, she asked me to wait 90 days. And today is day 91. And she was specific, and I respected specific." He said, "Mom left this." I said, "She left a letter for you in the box at the bank. I have it here. I want you to read it before we talk about anything else." He took the letter. He read it. I sat across from my son, and I watched him read his mother's handwriting, and I watched his face do the things that a man's face does when he is reading the last thing a person he loved is ever going to say to him directly. He read it twice. Then he set it down. He said, "She knew." I said, "She knew for 2 years." He said, "She never said anything to me." I said, "No." He said, "Why?" I said, "Because she said it was not her place to intervene in your marriage. She said her place was to make sure the truth was documented before anyone had a reason to argue with it. And she said her place was to protect me. And she said her place was to trust you to make the right decision when you had the information you needed." He said, "What information?" I set Felicia's folder on the table. He read it slowly. All of it. The account, the transfers, the LLC, the pattern. When he finished, he sat very still. He said, "Dad, how long have you had this?" I said, 91 days. He said, "You waited." I said, "Your mother asked me to wait." He looked at the folder, and then at his mother's letter, and then at me. He said, "She built all of this while she was sick." I said, "She built all of this while she was dying." "Yes, so that you would have what you needed when you were ready for it, and so that I would be protected, while I was too slow with grief to protect myself." David put his hands flat on the table, the way you put your hands flat when you need a surface to hold. He said, "What do I do?" I said, "That is up to you. Constance has copies of everything. Whatever you decide, the documentation exists. Your mother made sure of that." He said, "And you? What do you think I should do?" I looked at my son. I said, "I think you should take everything in that folder to an attorney, and I think you should have a very honest conversation with your wife, and I think you should listen very carefully to what she says when she has no reason to believe you already know what you know." He said, "And then?" I said, "And then you will know what kind of man you are going to be about it, and I will support whatever that is." He looked at the letter again. He said, "She loved you so much." I said, "I know." He said, "She loved me too, even knowing all of this." I said, "She loved you first. That is why she documented it instead of destroying it." Before I close this story, I want to speak to you directly, because this story is about love as much as it is about anything else. The specific kind of love that does not sit quietly and hope things resolve themselves. The kind that does the hard work of preparation, that rents a safety deposit box, that hires a forensic accountant, that writes 4 months of observations in a document called What I Know, that leaves an envelope with 2 nurses and a specific instruction and a key. If you have someone in your life like Pauline, tell them today what they mean to you. Not tomorrow, today. And if you are the person watching from the margins, taking notes, building the thing that the people you love will need when you are not there to hand it to them directly, I want you to know that what you are doing is love, the most complete and demanding and selfless form of it. Pauline never got to see the box opened. She never got to see David read the letter. She never got to see what the 90 days produced, or what came after them. She did it anyway. She built it anyway. That is who she was. The roses on the east side of the garden get more water now. I have not forgotten once. Share this with someone who needs to hear a story about a woman who spent her last 18 months protecting the people she loved. Hit that like button, subscribe so you never miss a story, drop a comment, and tell me about someone in your life who built something for you that you did not understand until you needed it. I will see you in the next one.